I suppose we should warn you right away that the clip that you're watching now is from an upcoming video game. It gets a little bit intense, so if those of you who are a little squeamish might want to probably stop here and fast forward a little bit. But this is from a game called Dead Island 2. It's one of many, many, almost countless numbers of upcoming video games that feature your chance to get into and fight the zombie apocalypse. Much the same way that the runaway hit show Walking Dead allows people at home to wonder aloud whether or not they'd be able to survive the zombie apocalypse and be able to survive with a hammer and so on. But here's the point. Oh, hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott. The point is this. In every version of these zombie movies and games that I've ever seen, it is always a world of dog-eat-dog where essentially your smart play is to shoot everybody on sight. In Walking Dead, small groups of human survivors are now in a civil war with other small groups of human survivors, killing each other off much more effectively than the zombies ever did. And needless to say, it's a pretty bleak picture. But here's what interested me about all these games. And there's a lot that interests me about these games. My question to you two gentlemen is this. Sadly, zombie apocalypse is never going to happen. But there is, in fact, there is a large number of scenarios that could result in essentially the destruction of civilization as we know it, the absolute loss of electrical power. There's scenarios where the gigantic pandemic basically wipes out 90% or 95% of the population. Those things are not impossible. So my question for both of you is this. Did that mean, or would that mean rather, that this is automatically a dog-eat-dog dystopia? Scott, let's start with you. If it were me crawling out of the wreckage of this, I haven't had any experience on a motorcycle blowing people's heads off with shotguns. My general job is to try and talk to people and get them to change their mind and pay me for it. And what you've got is you have, I'm talking strictly about America. It's the only society we can comment on intelligently. What you've got in this country is hundreds of millions of people who are used to doing the civil thing. We talk about how violent this culture is, but we stay in traffic and we stand in line and, pretty much normal cooperative behavior. Do you think that in the face of an enormous civilization-destroying catastrophe that we would be reduced to this kind of dog-eat-dog behavior, or do you think something better might happen?
I don't think there's such a thing as a civilization-destroying catastrophe unless it destroys all humanity completely. Because I think this civilization exists as long as humans exist. I'm always fascinated by this dystopian fantasy. I mean, two things that are fascinating to me. Number one is this unnatural attraction to the living dead. The idea of a zombie at all seems to have this peculiar hold on, I don't know if it's around the world, but here in the United States, it's just an unbelievable sort of creepy attraction to this whole idea of zombies at all. And then secondly, in this sort of dystopian fantasy that a lot of these stories involve, I think that the overriding message, Bill, is frankly that the only thing that stands between you and, and utter chaos is this gossamer tissue of government. Yep. And
that's what I want to get at.
Once, once governance was eliminated or government was debilitated in some way, we would of course be at each other's throats immediately. There would be no voluntary organizations of citizens trying to help each other or anything, that we would immediately tear each other limb from limb and be a terror to each other. I don't think that's what happens. And in fact, I think through most of our history, you've seen in situations where we are hard pressed, people come together. Even I'm thinking about the Blitz in London during World War II. I mean, it's unbelievable. Thousands and thousands of people killed by bombs from Germany. Their buildings destroyed. All public water systems destroyed. Their ability to have organized fire departments for a time was destroyed in various neighborhoods. And what did people do? bucket brigades. I mean, they immediately came up with ways to fight fires. They had this whole little system where these guys would come around. The Germans were dropping these incendiaries that would start little fires. And so they came up with this whole network of volunteers whose job it was to snuff out those little incendiary devices when they hit the ground. In every situation where we've seen, at least in civilized countries, and I hate to put it this way, in sort of Judeo-Christian countries, you've seen that the instinct is rather to preserve civilization than destroy it. That we see our own self-interest best nurtured by our mutual interest, and so we immediately find ways to work together. I often think, what would happen here if, Texas is prone to getting tornadoes, and that's why we all live in brick houses in these housing subdivisions. But what happens when tornadoes come? Well, immediately they start organizing at the local church. What happens if, as in a recent episode a little bit east of here, the local church was ripped apart? Well, they get together somewhere else. And, people all come together to help
Houston floods.
Their neighbor. Yeah, the Houston floods. I mean, there's a song by Rodney Atkins where he says, he was watching TV and there was a little town that some twister tore apart. And the line that chokes me up every time, he says, and people came from miles around just to help their neighbors out. That's the way we see other Americans. Even people elsewhere in the world, we see them as our neighbors, even though they're thousands of miles away. It wouldn't happen that way.
Just two quick things to comment on that. My mom was 9 years old during the Blitz. She remembers, before they were evacuated the country, she remembers seeing Winston Churchill standing on a pile of rubble holding up the V for Victory sign, and that must have been quite encouraging, I think.
Yeah.
And your question about the zombies is interesting, by the way. This is just parenthetically. I think the reason people are so fascinated with zombies is because in this politically correct age, it's the only villain that we can kill.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's the only
and
people that we
numbers.
can kill. They're not animals. They look human, but they're not human. They have no souls. They have no brains, and so they are predators. And so you can basically gun them down and hit them with flamethrowers and all the rest of it without any sense of remorse or so on. Steve, imagine a world like that where you have. Where civilization's fallen apart. You could make the argument, yes, people are nice in Houston, and yes, they're nice during tornadoes because they know that there's a larger force of law out there and help is on its way, and so on and so on and so on. But when you're fighting for food, and that's really the issue, right? Yeah. When there is no food anymore, the assumption is that people are going to be murdering each other over cans of peaches. Do you think that is the case, or do you think that the history of civilization in this country and cooperation would basically lead to a number of small enclaves of civilized behavior that would eventually get in touch with other large enclaves of civilized behavior?
This country didn't happen on accident. This country happened because there was a great older civilization, a British civilization, that came to these shores, and some great men on these shores realized that rights weren't just for Englishmen, they were for all men, and founded this country on a purpose, and that being the purpose. Let me attack your question kind of sideways. One of the first books that was ever recommended to me when I started blogging, so we were talking 14, 15, almost 16 years ago now, is called Gilligan Unbound. And I read this thing. It's just delightful. I can't remember the author's name to save my life. But it was an analysis of Gilligan's Island as a microcosm of America, where and this is probably why the left hates the show, not because it was silly and ridiculous, which it was, but the premise of the show was, if you take 7 different Americans, of 7 different archetypes, and stick them together on a desert island with nothing, they will form a little microcosm of American culture and political culture right there on a desert island where the highest tech thing they got going for them is a way to split coconuts in half. And it also goes to the violence part. Goes to something, a conversation I've had with my wife on a number of occasions. We'll be watching the news or a movie where you see the professional SWAT team go against the team of kidnappers, and you've got the kidnappers yelling at each other. They can't agree on anything, and the SWAT team are silently using hand signals and surrounding and killing all the bad guys, rescuing the hostages. Or when the military goes up against a bunch of semi-organized terrorists, the terrorists are all yelling at each other, heading for the door or whatever, and then the special forces or the army guys, whatever, just very quietly and professionally dispatch with the bad guys. Because this is what happens when you put a trained force up against thugs. Every single time. Maybe the thugs get lucky now and then, but no, typically 90% of the time, the good guys just because they are organized and trained. They're not just a bunch of hotheads trying to get away with a crime or subjugation or whatever. So I believe that this is the premise of Gilligan Unbound, that Americans have a genius for self-organizing, applies to survival after the apocalypse. That, of course, we would organize ourselves in, and I guess the same way that Rick and his crew have done in The Walking Dead. And I firmly believe that civilization, at least here on this continent, would win in the end.
Well, if we ever do face that kind of apocalypse here, I think hopefully all of us will learn the lessons of Gilligan's Island. And the lessons of Gilligan's Island are pretty simple.
Have a movie star?
If there were 7 of them on the boat and one of them drowned, and the person who drowned was the professor, they'd be dead in a week. If the person who had drowned was Gilligan, they'd be off the island in a week. So basically, that's the thing I'm going to take forward.
It's all about triage,
into the dystopic future. I think, obviously, that a fair amount of this is going to depend on where you are. Obviously, in cities, it's not a reflection so much on city dwellers as it is that these people are dependent on external services, external food source, and all these other things that have been their entire lives. They're dependent on law and external forces. That's what life in cities is all about. I wouldn't want to be in a city. You could make the case that in some parts of America, you wouldn't notice an awful lot of difference. You know, there are some places where people have their own generators, their own supplies of fuel or so on. I can tell you what I would do. I would make every effort possible to put a small perimeter around a defensible body of water, and I would make every effort to restore as much of that civilization as I could immediately. That means getting all the gasoline I could, all the generators I could. I'd be working on solar panels. I'd be working on other means of energy and so on, wood, coal, all of it. But I would preserve an island of what we considered to be normal. And then I would try to expand that island out and make it clear to anybody that wanted to come here, we're going to judge you as individuals, and we're certainly happy to have you here, and you're going to have to pull your own weight. The days of welfare are over. And if you decide you want to come in here and start stealing things and start hurting people, if you haven't hurt them yet, we will just simply ask you to leave. And if you have, then we'll deal with what we have to deal with. We are self-selected for a number of things, but not just the British. Every single person that's come to America has selected themselves to be risk takers and to be people who are not afraid of the daunting. This huge history of this country, coming here from a place like Britain with laws and civilization to go out on the frontier is quite a courageous act. In any event, I think that this constant dystopia that we see all the time is something I never heard before until Scott said it. I think it's a fantasy. I think it's a fantasy about the darkest side of human nature, designed to pitch up the experience, the entertainment value of it. Not much fun in a movie where everybody cooperates and things basically return to normal in 20 years or so. But I hope that's the way it would be. And I like to think that I and my 2 colleagues here and those of you watching would be members of that remnant that understand that civilization is not a series of laws and vehicles supplied by tax dollars. It's an attitude of human dignity and respect and fundamental goodness that can be cultivated or destroyed, depending on which one you choose. For Steve and Scott and the rest of the crew here at BillWhittle.com, thank you very much for joining us, all made possible by members at BillWhittle.com. We've got gift memberships, discounts for young people and veterans. If you want to find out about that, you can go to BillWhittle.com. We'd love to have you. We'll see you next week right here on Right Angle.